I used popsicle sticks and other junk to make an icebox with working doors. The inspiration is this plastic Krisenbahn icebox kit. The dimensions are listed at the bottom, which makes it easier to recreate. I marked the dimensions on my craft paper, but I need to subtract the thickness of one stick from the top. I won't go into too much details about how I created this pattern since I'll list the dimensions in the description and I have a lot of fun details I want to focus on. I'm sketching out each of the individual pieces so it'll be easy to measure and cut them. I'm using miter shears to trim the popsicle sticks. I need space to add a popsicle stick going across the top, so I'm trimming the side sticks to fit. Numbering your pattern in your pieces can help keep you organized. I want to create a larger opening for the top door, so I'm removing about 1/8 of an inch of popsicle stick from the top piece. I'm nipping 2 of the cuts using my miter shears and finishing the cut using a craft knife. I get a lot of questions about my miter shears, so I link them in the description and in the comment section below if you'd like a pair of your own. I cut the middle piece that separates the 2 doors to be the same length as the bottom piece to keep the unit square. The center divider is a bit too thick, so I used a combo of my miter shears and sandpaper to make it thinner. I'm creating a decorative design for the number 2 piece and easily finding the center using a piece of folded paper. I marked the piece of wood at the same place the fold is on the piece of paper. I'm using some really cheap files to create my design. I'm starting with this pointy triangle type file right in the middle where I made my mark. I find using files is so much easier than using a craft knife and trying to cut intricate designs. I used a round file on each of the ends and my miter shears to remove a lot of the bulk in between the designs. You can see the curves starting to form, but there are a bunch of hard edges I'm softening with sandpaper. The edge of the pattern is straight up and down, so I added a curved bevel using some sandpaper. I cut a 6th piece that goes above the bottom piece using a coffee stir stick. I glued all of the joints according to my pattern over a piece of wax paper so it doesn't stick to the paper. I'm checking that all the joints are square using a Lego. I finished the face frame by adding the 6th and final piece. I used the same techniques to create 2 side panels. I agonized for a few minutes about whether I should add a horizontal piece of coffee stir stick. Let me know what you think, but I decided against it. I cut all of the pieces for the 2 side panels at the same time before gluing them together. I used a larger popsicle stick to close the side panels. I sanded the faces of each of the pieces to remove the pencil marks and make them more even. I'm assembling the front and side with a little help from my friends. I have a nice pile of scraps from a laser cut dollhouse miniature kits. I cut this bit of scrap into 4 pieces to ensure the front panels are perfectly square. I'm cutting a back panel using foam core with the same inner dimensions as the front. I used some more foam core to cut some shelves. You can use wood for the entire construction if you like, but I only used wood on the areas I'll be staining. I prefer to use a cheap, easy to cut material like foam core for the interior pieces and back which will be painted. Tape or rubber bands would work well for this, but I'm using these adorable clamps I got a couple Christmases ago to hold the pieces together while they dry. To prep the walls for paint and smooth things out, I'm covering up the interior roughness using some scrap cardstock. I made the doors large enough to slightly overlap my openings. I need to fill each of the back panels with some more popsicle stick, but to make sure it doesn't overlap the interior of the door, I traced it from the inside. Sanding the entire face not only makes them more uniform, but will remove a lot of glue residue for staining later. The shelves and clamps stabilized the body, so I sanded the bottom flat. The popsicle sticks come together at the corner in a pretty sharp point, so I softened that as well. Let's all admire these smooth corners. I rounded the edge of the front doors as well to give them a slight bevel. To create the top, you can glue a combination of popsicle sticks together, but I'm using this scrap of basswood I've had for a while. I need some overhang on the front and sides, so I sketched out the approximate size I think I need. I rounded off the square edges of the top using some more sandpaper at about a 45-degree angle. This beveled edge adds a nice bit of detail. The laser cut scraps I used in each corner adds some surface area for the top to stick to. To add some stability and prevent warping, I glued some scrap pieces of popsicle stick to the underside of the top. I covered it up with more cardstock. I left it too much overhang because I'm adding a trim piece underneath the top. I'm mitering the corners by just eyeballing it. I trimmed the first piece with my craft knife at an angle I thought was about 45 degrees. I used my angle cut side piece to draw a line on the front piece so the edges meet nicely. I'm sorry I can't give better instruction on how to eyeball your miters like this, but it's something I learned with practice. Once I glued the pieces in place, I realized I cut the top a bit too wide and there's too much overhang. I was a little bit nervous to do it, but I sketched a line and trimmed off the excess. I rounded the edges to finish the cuts. I ran a bead of glue along all of the inside paper edges. Time for stain, and I'm choosing Waverly Antique Wax. I'm testing the color on the back of the door by brushing on the antique wax and wiping away the excess. I really like the color, although there are some areas that wood glue resisted the stain. I discovered Waverly Antique Wax through Tiny Keyhole Minis, and it's one of my favorite products. You could also use watered down brown acrylic paint or wood stain in a pen or jar. This is the first piece of 112 scale furniture I've ever made, so when I reached this stage of adding color, I got really excited. When I stained the top, there were a couple areas of glue repelling the stain, so I sanded it while the stain was still wet and added a new layer. This stuff is really forgiving because it just blended in very nicely. For a tiny bit of age and dimension, I brushed a small amount of black paint around all of the edges of the inside panels. I discovered some more glue repelling the stain, so I sanded and restained. Sanding took no time at all, and I think it was worth the effort to get such a nice result. I'm making the inside more uniform using some white acrylic paint. I didn't glue the back on until the very end, and it came in really handy because I needed to go inside of the icebox multiple times. I'm adding a thick layer of insulating foam to the doors using some foam core. I cut all 4 sides for each of the 2 foam core panels using an angled craft knife for added detail. I made one for each door. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I used real hinges and tiny nails to attach to the doors. First, I used some white glue to attach the hinges to the doors to hold them in place. Then I used a little pin to pre-drill a hole where the nail will go. These nails were too long, so I had to nip them a bit shorter. I used my pliers to press the nail into the small hole I created, and then used a second set of pliers to push it in the rest of the way. Fortunately for me, the inside of the icebox fit really well on the top of my 1-2-3 block, which enabled me to bang the nails in to attach the doors. This whole process took forever, and in the end, the top door was very crooked and I could never get it straight. There are some secrets for properly attaching tiny hinges, and apparently I don't know them. There's a large gap around 3 sides of the bottom door, which doesn't work well for a miniature fridge, so I removed that as well. I'm using some tape to hold the door in place while I try a new method. With my temporary tape method, both of the doors are sitting nice and flush against the front of the icebox. However, they will not stay closed. I'm solving that problem with these teeny tiny magnets I bought from Temu. These magnets are really strong and cute as a button. I used some super glue to attach 4 magnets on the inside. To make sure I glue the corresponding magnets in the right direction, I attached them together and then made a mark. I made a slight recess in the door using a drill bit, glued in the magnets, and covered them with brown paint. The system works really well, so I'm replacing the tape hinges using some fabric. Had I known how quick and easy the fabric and magnet combo would be, I would never have tried the real hinges to start with. I confirmed the fabric hinges work well, so it's time to attach the foam pieces. The metal hinges and tiny nails really sapped my patience and took up a lot of time, so I decided to add the foam panels using some double-sided tape. This enabled me to quickly add the foam panels without having to wait for any glue to dry. You could leave it just like this, but I'm disguising the fabric by staining it the same color as the exterior. I think this sort of tricks your eye into thinking the wooden door continues and makes my foam on the doors stand out a bit more. We know the real hinges are hidden on the inside, but I'm adding some faux hinges on the outside using some vintage Dresden trim. Dresden is die-cut paper-backed foil that's still being made today. Here I'm showing the piece wrapped around the door, but when I installed it, I cut them into 2 pieces and glued them separately. I am so in love with the 4 hinges, and I used more of the Dresden trim to make 2 latch-looking things. This simulates the kind of hardware that hangs off the door and connects it to the cabinet. To protect the overhang, I added some wood glue. The wood glue dries really strong, so these pieces won't snap off. My foil pieces are just glued to the surface, but to make it look like they're attached with nails, I'm using some of this nail decor. I used tiny dabs of white glue to attach the studs to my faux hinges. For the latches, I switched from the larger size to the smaller ones. It's kind of impossible to see on camera, but I subdued the gold just a little bit with some antique gold rub and buff. I'm using some panel line accent color to emphasize the details in the Dresden trim and the tiny rivets. You could also substitute watered down acrylic paint. I really like how the wash settles in the details and adds dimension. To make the drip pan for the underside, I coated this piece of plastic with some ultra matte sealer and gave it a trim. I made it a lot shorter, but made sure to keep it tall enough so it's still visible under the decorative skirting. It was a bit too deep, so I trimmed the back. Adding the matte sealer helps the silver rub and buff stick very well. My fingers are dirty enough, so I applied it with a Q-tip. Ice boxes often have caster wheels at the bottom, but the casters I have are a bit undersized. I'm making my own super simple casters, starting with these really cheap beads I got at the Dollar Tree. I'm using a foil lid from a casserole dish to cut the sides that hold the wheels. I'm cutting an elongated shape with a rounded end that's slightly smaller than the bead so it's still visible. I used white glue to attach the glass beads to the foil. I'm filling the space and giving myself something to attach more foil to using some foam core. I added more foil so the foam is sandwiched in between the two pieces. I added a nail stud in the center to make it look like this is how the wheels are attached. Some black paint disguises the foam core. I attached the pieces with hot glue and used some black paint to age the drip pan. I used the two casters up front and stained pieces of chopstick in the rear. I just realized the top part that holds the ice block is supposed to be lined with galvanized metal, so I'm giving it a paint job. To simulate the look of galvanized steel, I started with a darker base coat followed by a lighter gray. To really make this look like galvanized metal, I'm stippling on a small amount of silver paint. The dabs of silver slightly catch the light. I created the galvanized look in the entire upper interior. I'm painting a bit of popsicle stick white to use as a shelf on the inside. I'm using this pretty glass ice block I got from Earth and Tree Miniatures. To fake the look of frost on the inside, I'm adding a bit of spackle into the corners and along the edges. Before allowing it to dry, I dampened the surface with some water and sprinkled on some white sand. I would have brushed on a bit of glitter, but I already packed it since I'm moving soon. This project was a request from one of my patrons. Consider joining for free or for $3 a month. Watch this video next to see how I created a rustic kitchen inside of a cardboard room box.